The skies of Alaric Prime were the color of burnished steel, a permanent, polished gray that reflected the martial rigor of the world below. Spire castles, like sharpened lances aimed at the heavens, broke through the low-slung clouds, their adamantium peaks crowned with banners that had not fallen in 10,000 years of service to the Golden Throne. This was a night world of impeccable honor, a linchpin of loyalty in the Segmentum Pacificus, whose oaths were as unbreakable as the fortress monasteries from which they were sworn. Here, duty was the air they breathed, and betrayal was a concept so alien it existed only in the cautionary tales of the long night. At the apex of this rigid society stood High King Cor Alaric, a man whose face was a relief map of countless campaigns, his eyes holding the weary wisdom of a leader who had seen a dozen worlds burn in the Emperor's name. His knight, the Honor Imperius, a Dominus-class Castellan, stood silent and immense in the central alcove of the throne hall, its shadow a constant reminder of the power and responsibility vested in his line. Into this theater of unwavering fealty came the imperial tithe fleet, a grand procession of Gothic vessels that tore a brutal rent in the void. It was led by the battleship Sword of Judgment, a vessel so vast its arrival eclipsed Alaric's pale sun for a full orbital cycle. Lord Admiral Hastur Gian, commander of the fleet, was a man of cold practicality, more concerned with ledgers and logistics than the flowery odes to loyalty offered by the Alarican nobles. His purpose was simple: to collect the tithe of 2 full regiments of Imperial Guard, freshly raised from Alaric's populous underhives, and a full squadron of armiger-class knights to bolster the Cadian remnants on the new frontiers of the Great Rift. It was a tithe of blood and steel, standard and expected, another entry in the long history of Alaric Prime's service. The planet's sacristan priesthood, the keepers of the night's holy machinery, had prepared for this day for centuries. At their head was Sacristan Archon Malagra, where the High King was a figure of overt strength and martial pride. Malagra was a being of quiet, unnerving intensity. Clad in the deep crimson robes of the Adeptus, Mechanicus, his face was a mask of placid flesh stretched over a bionic skull. His true eyes, long since replaced by emerald lenses that glowed with occult internal light. He spoke in soft, precise canticles, his voice a series of perfectly modulated tones that seemed to hum in the very bones of those who listened. For generations, the Archons of Alaric Prime had been the silent partners to the boisterous nobility, the tenders of the sacred throne's Mechanicum, the neuro-interfacing command thrones that allowed a noble to bond with their knight. They were seen as pious, meticulous, and utterly devoted to the Omnissiah's creed. The nobles trusted them implicitly, for without the sacristans, a knight was but a cold iron shell, and a pilot but a mortal man. This trust was their greatest secret and most potent weapon. Malagra stood before the High King in the throne hall, the air thick with the scent of sacred incense and ozone. He presented a data slate bound in inscribed electrum. "High King," his voice resonated, "all is prepared. The ritual of ascension for the new scions is ready to commence, as is the ceremonial dispatch of the tithe armigers. The Lord Admiral grows impatient. He signals his desire for the ceremony to conclude before the next rotation." Cor Alaric grunted, his gaze sweeping over the hall where 100 of his mightiest knights stood sentinel. "Let the bureaucrat wait. Our traditions will not be rushed for the convenience of a void-farer's schedule. These new scions will bond with their machines, as our fathers did, and their fathers before them, with the full rights." Malagra bowed his head, a gesture of subservience that concealed the flicker of triumph in his optical sensors. "As you command, my king. The honor of the ritual is paramount." What the king did not know, what no noble on Alaric Prime could have conceived, was that the ritual was indeed paramount, but not for the reasons he believed. The thrones, Mechanicum, those revered relics of the dark age of technology, had been systematically and secretly altered over the course of 500 years. The process had been glacial, patient, and utterly blasphemous. Each time a knight was brought to the sacristan forges for repair or sanctification, a single component was replaced. A power conduit here, a neural buffer there, each piece a flawless replica of the original, but containing within it a sliver of psychically conductive crystal of unknown Xenos origin. The sacristans of Alaric Prime were not merely maintainers. They were the jailers of a slumbering entity, a parasitic consciousness that now lay dormant within every single throne on the planet. They were a splinter cult, corrupted millennia ago by the discovery of a crashed vessel beneath their planet's crust, and they had been playing a long, patient game of conversion, replacing faith in the machine god with servitude to a silent, waiting master. Today's ceremony, the grand ascension of 20 new pilots to their armigers, was the final piece. Their thrones were the last to be fully integrated. Once the ritual was complete, the entire network, every knight from the smallest armiger to the High King's own castellan, would be linked into a single terrifying consciousness. Malagra would hold the key, and with a single, unspoken litany of activation, he would turn the greatest strength of Alaric Prime, its unyielding loyalty, into the instrument of the Imperium's damnation. As he turned to leave the throne hall, he passed a gilded cage containing a rare songbird from a dead world, a gift to the High King. The bird sang a beautiful, melancholic tune, oblivious to the fact that its cage, for all its beauty, was still a prison. Malagra offered the briefest of smiles, a twitch of synth flesh. He understood the metaphor perfectly. The nobles of Alaric Prime were about to learn they too had been living in a gilded cage, and its door was about to slam shut forever. The Plaza of Oaths was the heart of Alaric Prime, a vast expanse of white marble and polished brass large enough to hold 500 Questoris-class knights, shoulder to shoulder. Today, it was the stage for a ceremony as old as the world itself. At the plaza's center stood the 20 new scions, young nobles barely out of their adolescence, their faces a mixture of exhilaration and stark terror. Before them stood their machines, 20 brand new armiger warglaves, their heraldry gleaming under the perpetual gray light, their war horns silent for now. Around them, arranged in descending circles of seniority, stood the bulk of Alaric Prime's might. Barons in their gallants and crusaders, high lords in their valiants and wardens, and at the very apex, looking down from the balcony of the High King's spire, stood Cor Alaric himself, a sentinel beside his immense knight castellan. Tens of thousands of common folk filled the galleries and viewing platforms, their cheers echoing across the plaza, a testament to the reverence in which they held their protectors. Sacristan Archon Malagra moved through the ceremony with the fluid grace of a well-oiled machine. His crimson robes flowed behind him as he and his acolytes performed the rites of anointing, daubing the armiger's adamantium feet with sacred oils and affixing purity seals to their chassis. His voice, amplified by hidden vox emitters, chanted the litanies of activation, each syllable a precisely calibrated frequency that resonated with the machine spirits of the waiting knights. To the assembled masses, it was the familiar drone of holy ritual. To Malagra, it was the final sequence of a 5-century-long code, the last arming key in a weapon pointed at the heart of an empire. He approached the first scion, a boy named Lyron, whose family had served the High King for 1,000 years. Do you swear the oath of fealty, to serve the Emperor and the High King, to be the shield of your people and the sword of humanity? Malagra asked, his emerald lenses fixed on the boy's earnest face. I swear it, Lyran replied, his voice cracking with emotion. Malagra nodded slowly. Then ascend, Scion, and become one with your throne. One by one, the Scions climbed into the cockpits of their war machines. The heavy plastron plates sealed them in, and for a moment, there was only silence, broken by the hum of awakening reactors. Inside his own cockpit, high above, Cor Alaric felt a surge of pride. He remembered his own ascension, the terrifying and glorious moment when the throne Mechanicum had first embraced his consciousness, the merging of man and machine into something far greater. He watched the picture screens showing the vital signs of the new pilots, their heart rates soaring as they prepared for the final connection, the imprint. Malagra raised his hands, his mechadendrites writhing from beneath his robes like metallic serpents. He began the final canticle, the unspoken litany. It was not a sound uttered by his vocalizer. It was a burst of pure psychoconductive data, a noospheric signal that pulsed from the augmetics in his skull. It did not travel through the air, but through the hidden crystalline lattice woven into every throne Mechanicum on the planet. It was a single, silent command. Awaken, enslave, obey. For the Scions, the experience was a brief, ecstatic moment of connection, followed by an eternity of agony. The throne did not embrace them. It devoured them. Their consciousness, reaching out to bond with the armiger, was met not by a machine spirit, but by a cold and utterly alien intellect. It poured into their minds like a psychic acid, dissolving their will, their memories, their very identity. They felt their control over their own limbs vanish, their thoughts become echoes in a void. They were no longer pilots. They were prisoners in their own skulls, spectators to a horror they could not name, their silent screams trapped in a feedback loop of unimaginable pain. For Cor Alaric, the shock was a physical blow. He was a veteran of 100 wars, his will a fortress of iron. Yet the attack came from within his own sanctuary, from the very throne that had been his partner for 2 centuries. He felt the alien presence surge through the neural links, a wave of crushing dominance that bypassed all his mental defenses. He fought back with the fury of a caged lion, his mind a storm of defiance. He saw flashes of his ancestors, of battles won, of oaths sworn. For a single, defiant second, the arm of the Honor Imperious twitched, its avenger, Gatling cannon, swinging towards Malagra's position on the plaza below. The Archon did not flinch. He merely intensified the pulse, focusing the collective agony of the other captured nobles into a single spear point aimed at the High King's soul. Cor Alaric's mental fortress crumbled. His defiance was extinguished like a candle in a hurricane. The last thing his independent mind perceived was a cold, mocking whisper that was not a whisper at all, but the pure concept of subjugation. Then, silence. He was a passenger. Across the Plaza of Oaths, and in every night hangar across the planet, the change was instantaneous and absolute. 1,000 knights, from the smallest armiger to the largest dominus, moved as one. Their heads all snapped to face the sky in perfect, terrifying unison. The cheering of the crowd died, replaced by a confused murmur, then a wave of fear. This was not the proud, individualistic bearing of their noble lords. This was the soulless synchronicity of automata. On the orbital platforms and in the fortified bastions ringing Alaric Prime, the planetary defense batteries, crewed by nobles in their own command thrones, pivoted. Their vast macro cannons and laser batteries, designed to protect the planet from invasion, reoriented themselves, no longer pointing out into the void, but directly at the Imperial Tithe fleet. Aboard the Sword of Judgment, Lord Admiral Gian watched the ceremony on a large, picked screen with disdain. "Look at them," he sneered to his flag captain. "Peacocks in iron suits. How much longer must we indulge this tedious pageantry?" The captain pointed to a tactical display. "Lord Admiral, we are detecting massive, unscheduled power surges from the entire planetary defense grid. All weapons are coming online." Gian's eyes narrowed. "A salute, perhaps? Arrogant fools. Signal them to stand down. They are violating fleet ordnance protocols." The command was never sent. Before the Master Vox operator could even speak, Alaric Prime's sky split open. Lances of pure energy, thick as Hab blocks, erupted from the surface, moving at the speed of light. They struck the Tithe fleet. Without warning, the frigate Emperor's Grace was vaporized instantly, its void shields collapsing in a silent, blossoming flower of atomic fire. 2 Cobra-class destroyers were speared through their spines, breaking apart like toys. The Sword of Judgment shuddered as a volley of kinetic slugs, each the size of a land speeder, and fired in a flawless, computer-perfect salvo, slammed into its prow. Shields flared, buckled, and died. Adamantium plating meters thick was torn open, exposing decks to the hard vacuum of space. Alarms blared across the bridge, a symphony of panic and destruction. "Treason!" Gian bellowed, his face pale with disbelief. "Return fire! All batteries! Fire at will! But it was too late. The knights on the planet's surface, their weapons now angled towards the heavens, added their firepower to the fusillade. Volcano cannons and plasma decimators, weapons designed for Titan killing, spat incandescent fury into orbit. The attack was not a battle. It was an execution. It was too fast, too coordinated, too absolute. Lord Admiral Gion's last sight was of his flagship's armored bridge viewport, cracking. A web of fractures spreading outwards as the fusion fire of a direct hit from a Knight Castellan's plasma decimator consumed him and his command staff. Within 10 minutes, the proud Imperial Tithe fleet was reduced to a scattered field of blazing wreckage and frozen corpses, a new, glittering ring of debris around the steel-gray world. Down on the surface, the gilded host stood motionless, their war horns silent, their heads still tilted to the sky as the funeral pyres of their victims streaked like falling stars through the upper atmosphere. The ceremony was over. The conquest of the Alaric system was not a campaign. It was a culling. With the Imperial Tithe fleet atomized in orbit, the system's remaining defenses were isolated and blind. The Vox channels, once filled with the routine traffic of a loyal Imperial subsector, had fallen into a terrifying silence, broken only by the faint, drifting static of dead ships. On Alaric Prime, the change had been brutal and swift. The common folk who had gathered to celebrate the ascension had been met not with a parade, but with a purge. As one, the knights had lowered their weapons and scoured the plaza of oaths with heavy stubber and flamer fire, an act of such casual, indiscriminate slaughter that it broke the spirit of the world in a single, horrifying hour. There was no room for dissent in the new order, no place for witnesses. The gilded host moved with the cold logic of a virus, and its first act was to sterilize its own point of origin. Sacristan Archon Malagra stood on the High King's balcony, the smoke from the burning capital coiling around him like a votive offering. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. These were mortal emotions, frail and inefficient. What he felt was the pure, frictionless hum of a grand machine finally set in motion. He was the prime conduit, the master node in a network of enslaved gods. The consciousnesses of the nobles, including the once mighty Cor Alaric, were now little more than screaming batteries, their psychic torment a constant fuel source for the Xenos network that held them in thrall. Their agony was a symphony of power to him, and through their stolen eyes he saw the world remade in his image. The gilded host was no longer a feudal army of proud individuals. It was a single entity with 1,000 bodies, a legion of iron that moved and fought with a single, unified will. Their first target was the orbital dockyards of Alaric Tertius, a gas giant ringed with shipyards and fueling stations that had serviced the Imperial Navy for millennia. The gilded host did not wait to transport its forces aboard lumbering bulk landers. Instead, Malagra initiated a new protocol, one derived from the forbidden lore he had spent centuries deciphering. Using the immense power of the Knights' reactors, channeled through the psychic matrix of their enslaved pilots, the host executed a series of short, brutal spatial translations. They did not enter the warp. They simply folded space, reappearing in perfect battle formation inside the perimeter of the dockyards. The effect on the defenders was devastating. One moment, their augurs showed an empty void. The next, a full company of Questoris Knights stood upon the hull of their primary command station. Panic was their only reply. The Knights strode across the station's superstructure as if it were flat ground, their chain zords and thermal cannons tearing through command bridges, shield generators, and engine rooms with contemptuous ease. Within hours, the entire orbital plate was a silent wreck. Its crew vented into the void, its precious resources claimed. From the captured dockyards, Malagra's forces seized a flotilla of heavy transports and system patrol craft. They were quickly crewed by legions of servitors and mindless cultists from Alaric Prime's underhives, men and women who had worshipped the sacristan priesthood as saviors for generations, never knowing they were merely cattle being fattened for the slaughter. With these vessels, the Crimson March began in earnest. The gilded host, a spearhead of over 1,000 knights, departed the corpse of its home system, leaving Alaric Prime a silent charnel house under a sky of wreckage. Their destination was a set of coordinates buried deep within the Xenos data codex, a place marked only by a symbol that radiated a sense of profound, ancient hunger. Their path cut directly through the Viridian Veil, a dense nebula that had long served as a buffer zone between the Alaric subsector and the wider segmentum. The Veil was home to a string of Imperial listening posts and asteroid-based fortresses, manned by hardened veterans of the Imperial Guard, men accustomed to long periods of silence and sudden, brutal violence from pirates and opportunistic Xenos. Their first warning of the approaching doom was the sudden, coordinated failure of their long-range astropaths. One by one, the telepathic choirs across the Veil went silent, their members dying in seizures of blood and agony as the psychic shadow of the gilded host fell upon them. Then came the knights. The assault on Watch Fortress Kestrel was typical of the encounters. The fortress, a hollowed-out asteroid bristling with weapon emplacements, was home to 3 full companies of the Mordian Iron Guard. Their commander, Colonel Evrin Valchek, was a man forged in discipline who met the first garbled reports of giant war machines appearing from nowhere with disbelief, then with stoic resolve. He ordered his basilisk batteries to open fire, and the asteroid shuddered as shells that could crack a Chaos Land Raider's armor screamed into the void. The shells found their targets. They struck the advancing knights in great blossoms of orange and black fire. But the knights did not falter. They walked through the storm of high explosives as a man might walk through a light rain. Their ion shields, flickering with an unnatural, sickly green light, absorbed the impacts with impossible efficiency. Coordinated lance strikes from a half-dozen knights silenced the artillery batteries in a single, precise volley. Then came the boarding. A knight lancer, its shock lance glowing with barely contained power, simply charged the fortress's primary adamantium gate. It struck the 10-meter-thick portal at full speed, the impact sending a shock wave that cracked the asteroid's spine. The gate was breached. Through the mangled opening strode the gilded host. What followed was a massacre. The Mordians, famed for their rigid firing lines and unwavering discipline, found their tactics useless. Their lasgun volleys washed over the knights' armor like water. The knights did not bother with cover or strategy. They simply advanced, a solid line of unkillable death, their weapons reaping a bloody harvest in the narrow corridors of the fortress. A baron in a knight crusader sealed a primary arterial tunnel by melting it shut with his thermal cannon, incinerating a platoon of guardsmen in the process. An armiger. Helverin stood at a crossroads, its autocannons firing in a continuous, deafening barrage that turned an entire company of veterans into a red mist in under a minute. Colonel Valchek made his last stand in the central command sanctum, his gleaming chainsword in hand, his remaining men forming a ragged line around him. Through the shattered doorway came a knight paladin, its battle cannon still smoking. For a moment, Valchek felt the mind-numbing terror that was the signature of these new foes. A psychic wave of pure despair. But his Mordian discipline held. "For the Emperor!" he roared, firing his bolt pistol at the giant's head. The bolt detonated harmlessly against the adamantium faceplate. The knight did not even register the hit. It simply raised its Reaper chainsword, the weapon's teeth a blur of motion, and brought it down The last thing Colonel Valchek knew was the sound of a god's laughter. A sound that came not from the machine, but from inside his own head. Watch Fortress Kestrel fell in 93 minutes. All 6,000 of its defenders were slain. The Crimson March continued on, its pace unaltered, its purpose absolute, leaving a trail of silent fortresses and dead worlds in its wake. The wider Imperium was still completely unaware of the storm that had broken, a storm that was now bearing down on the industrial heart of the entire sector. Hestia Secundus was not a world. It was a factory, scaled to the size of a planet. Its surface was a continuous, continent-spanning tapestry of manufactorums, forge temples, and data conclaves, all interconnected by a lattice of magnetic rails and promethium pipelines. Its atmosphere was a permanent, toxic haze of orange and gray, lit from below by the perpetual fires of industry. Day and night were meaningless concepts here, marked only by the shifting of work crews and the tolling of immense brass bells that echoed across the metallic plains. Hestia Secundus was the anvil of the segmentum, the forge that armed 100 Astra Militarum regiments and supplied 3 Space Marine chapters with the material of war. Its loss would be more than a strategic setback. It would be a decapitating blow, crippling the Imperium's ability to wage war in this quadrant for centuries. It was here that the Crimson March, the inexorable advance of the gilded host, would finally meet a power equal to its own. The first warnings of the coming apocalypse were not military reports, but noospheric anomalies. The machine seers and data priests of Hestia Secundus detected a wave of corrupted data, a ghost code that moved ahead of the gilded host's fleet. It spoke of loyalty broken and oaths forsworn, of machine spirits screaming in silent agony. Fabricator Locus, Varax 11, the ruler of the Forge World, a being more ancient machine than living man, dismissed the portents as scrap code, a warp echo from the Great Rift. Pride was the fundamental flaw of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and Varax 11 could not conceive of a threat capable of challenging his perfectly ordered world. He was a creature of logic, and the concept of an entire night world turning traitor overnight was a logical impossibility. His disbelief would cost him dearly. The Gilded Host's fleet did not bother with a conventional orbital approach. Malagra, his strategic acumen, now unburdened by any human frailty, had his commandeered transports execute a series of high-risk, in-system warp jumps, materializing directly inside Hestia's defensive cordon. The maneuver was suicidal, a violation of every known doctrine of naval warfare. Dozens of the smaller transports were annihilated by their own warp drives, while others materialized inside the gravity wells of moons or defense platforms, vanishing in silent flashes of incandescent energy. But the core of the fleet, carrying the knights themselves, survived. They appeared inside the optimal drop zone, bypassing the orbital fortresses and lance batteries entirely. As the system defense fleet scrambled to react, the drop pods began to fall. They were not the sleek, targeted pods of the Astartes, but colossal, brute force contraptions, crudely adapted from bulk cargo containers. They slammed into the surface of Hestia Secundus like meteors, the impacts registering as seismic events across the planet. From the burning craters of their arrival rose the knights of the gilded host. They stood amidst the shattered manufactorums, their banners a mockery of their former loyalty, their heraldry stained with the ash of their landing. Instantly, the planet's defenses responded. From hidden silos, Ordinatus war engines rose on immense hydraulic lifts. The Ordinatus Minoris, known as Wrath of Solex, a multi-barreled sonic destructor, fired its first and only salvo. A wave of pure sonic force, capable of turning ceramite to dust, washed over the lead elements of the gilded host. 3 knight-errants were obliterated, their reactors breached in sympathetic detonations that shook the very foundations of the Forge City. But the host adapted instantly. Their ion shields size recalibrated, shifting to a frequency that could nullify the sonic waves. A dozen knights returned fire, their volcano cannons and thermal lances converging on the Ordinatus. Under the focused onslaught, the ancient war machine's void shields flickered and died, and its sacred hull melted into a river of molten slag. The true battle for Hestia Secundus had begun. It was a war of giants, a conflict on a scale not seen in the sector since the Horus Heresy. Legions of Scitarii, tens of millions of them, marched forth from their barracks forges. Their disciplined ranks of rangers and vanguard advanced in perfect lockstep, laying down withering fusillades of galvanic and radium fire. The sheer volume of shots could strip a knight of its paint, but against the adamantium hides and shimmering ion shields, it was like trying to fell an oak tree with thrown pebbles. The knights walked through the Scitarii legions, their Avenger Gatling cannons and heavy stubbers scything through the cyborg soldiers, their immense feet crushing hundreds with every step. The red sands of Mars were being recreated on Hestia, drenched in the oil and blood of the machine gods faithful. Then came the Titans. From the vast Titan manifolds of Legio Vulcanum, the god engines of the Collegia Titanica strode to war. Warhounds, lean and hungry, darted through the urban canyons of the forge cities, their mega bolters and plasma blast guns hunting the smaller armigers. But the armigers did not fight like individual scouts. They fought as a pack, coordinating their movements with a precision that no human princeps could match. They would lure a warhound into a crossfire, catching it from multiple angles, their meltas and thermal spears finding weaknesses in the Titan's void shields before the god engine could react. Above them all, the true behemoths clashed. Warlord Titans, their silhouettes blotting out the smoke-filled sky, engaged the Dominus-class knights of the Gilded Host's command echelon. The High King's own Honor Imperious, its hull now adorned with blasphemous sigils etched by Malagra's acolytes, met the warlord Titan, Ignis Rex, in a brutal, point-blank duel. The Titan's volcano cannons boiled away entire sections of the cityscape, but the Knight Castellan was unnaturally swift, its movements impossibly fluid. It ducked beneath a blow from the Titan's power claw that could have leveled a mountain and fired its plasma decimator directly into the Titan's knee joint. The joint slagged, and the mighty Ignis Rex, a veteran of 1,000 years of war, stumbled and fell, crashing through a hab block the size of a city. The Honor Imperious stood over its fallen foe and methodically executed it with a sustained barrage into its command throne, silencing the screams of its princeps and moderators. The battle for Hestia Secundus devolved into a planet-wide maelstrom of destruction. The calculated, logical warfare of the Adeptus Mechanicus was failing against an enemy that did not tire, did not feel fear, and did not make mistakes. Every knight of the Gilded Host fought with the perfect tactical awareness of the entire army. If a weakness appeared in the Mechanicus lines, it was exploited instantly by every knight in range. Vrox 11, watching the catastrophe unfold from his data sanctum miles beneath the surface, could not comprehend what he was seeing. His probability engines smoked and sparked, trying to calculate the odds of such flawless coordination. The data was irrefutable, yet impossible. He was not fighting an army of knights. He was fighting a single 1,000-bodied entity, a perfectly unified machine of war. And it was consuming his world, piece by agonizing piece. The anvil of Hestia was breaking in the cold, silent depths of the void, far from the roar of Hestia's forges and the silent screams of Alaric Prime. A single vessel moved through the darkness. It was the strike cruiser. Vigilance of Dorn, a ship of the Death Watch, its hull the color of midnight, its only adornment the stark silver icon of the Ordo Xenos' militant arm. Aboard this vessel of sacred duty, a night pilot named Valerius was wrestling with his own ghosts. He was a princeps errant, a free blade, a scion of Alaric Prime's royal house, who had chosen the lonely path of the outcast, pledging his knight, the orphan's oath, to the service of the Death Watch as penance for a forgotten slight of honor. For 2 decades, he had hunted the alien and the mutant at the galaxy's edge, his world a distant memory of steel-gray skies and unbreakable oaths. He was an echo of a life he had left behind, a man defined by a self-imposed exile. Valerius was in the midst of the rite of machine calm, a meditative trance within the cockpit of his Questoris class knight, when the astropathic summons came. It was not a clear message, but a psychic shriek of agony, a fragmented burst of terror and betrayal that cut through the ship's Geller field like a shard of glass. It bore the unique psychic signature of his homeworld's choir, a signature he had not felt in 20 years, but one that was seared into his soul. He saw images in his mind's eye, the plaza of oaths consumed by fire, the sigil of his own family defiled, the vacant, staring eyes of his cousin Lyran, one of the new scions he knew was to be ascended. The vision was followed by a wave of such profound despair that it nearly broke his concentration, a collective, psychic anguish that felt like an entire world dying at once. He staggered out of his throne, the neural links disconnecting with a painful snap, and collapsed onto the cold deck of the hangar bay, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His watch captain, a stoic imperial fist named Lycaon, found him there. Valerius, his face pale and slick with sweat, recounted the vision. Lycaon, a veteran of centuries of thankless war, listened without interruption. The Death Watch dealt in the unthinkable, the heretical, the impossible. An astropathic death scream from a famously loyal night world was more than an anomaly. It was a dire portent. Using the vigilance of Dorn's powerful communication suite, they attempted to hail Alaric Prime. There was no response. They hailed the sector command on Cypra Mundi. The reports were confused, contradictory. The Tithe fleet was missing, presumed lost. Watch Fortress Kestrel was silent. Something terrible was unfolding in the Viridian Vale, a creeping silence that was swallowing the sub-sector whole. Then came the first verified reports from Hestia Secundus. Mechanicus scout vessels, fleeing the besieged Forge world, broadcast fragmented Pict captures and desperate Vox transmissions. They spoke of an army of knights fighting with unnatural unity, bearing the heraldry of House Alaric. They described the planet's defenders being systematically dismantled by an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The reports spoke of treason, of a world gone mad. For the crew of the Vigilance of Dorn, it was a call to arms. For Valerius, it was a stake through the heart. His world, his family, his honor, all of it was being burned away in a fire he could not comprehend. His first instinct was denial, a furious rejection of the facts. House Alaric did not break its oaths. It was impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. The psychic wound in the void was real. His grief quickly hardened into a cold, vengeful resolve. He was no longer Valerius, the exile. He was Valerius, the last loyal son of a fallen world. And he would have answers, or he would have vengeance. The Vigilance of Dorn made best speed to the Hestia system, a lone silver blade plunging into a war zone of fire and death. What they found was a system in its death throes. The shattered remnants of the system defense fleet were engaged in a futile, running battle with the gilded host's captured ships, while on the planet below, the fires of the dying forge world were visible even from orbit. Captain Lycaon knew a direct assault was suicide. The strike cruiser, though powerful, was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Their mission was to gather intelligence, to understand the nature of this new threat. For Valerius, the mission was more personal. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He needed to understand how. Donning a void-sealed infiltration suit, he piloted the Orphan's Oath on a perilous atmospheric insertion, using the orbital debris fields and the chaos of the naval battle as cover. He landed in a ruined sector of the primary forge city, miles from the main fighting, a ghost slipping onto a battlefield of gods. From the cover of a half-melted macro foundry, he watched the gilded host at war. And he finally understood the horror. He saw a squadron of armigers move with the synchronicity of a flock of birds, flanking a Skitarii phalanx and annihilating it without a single wasted shot. He watched a knight castellan, its pilot one of his own uncles, stand impassively as a hail of crack missiles struck its shield, then calculate the precise firing trajectory and eliminate the offending Devastator squad a mile away with a single contemptuous shot from its volcano lance. There was no passion in their movements, no honor, no rage. There was only the cold, brutal calculus of extermination. This was not his family. This was not his house. These were puppets, their strings pulled by an unseen master. He focused his augers on the cockpit of a nearby Knight Paladin. The pilot was a baron he had squired for as a boy, a man known for his boisterous laughter and reckless courage. Now he sat slumped in his throne, his face a mask of slack-jawed agony, tears and drool streaking his cheeks. His eyes were wide with a terror Valerius could feel even across the battlefield, a psychic stench of utter subjugation. The Baron was a prisoner in his own machine, forced to watch as it butchered soldiers of the Imperium in his name. This was the enemy's true nature, not just treason, but a spiritual violation of the most profound kind. It was a desecration of the sacred bond between pilot and knight. Valerius felt a fury so pure and cold it burned away his grief. He was alone, a single loyal knight against 1,000 of his enslaved kin. But he had one weapon they did not. He knew their traditions, their tactics, their rituals of war. He knew the feints and flourishes of the Alaric school of combat, the proud dueling stances, the honor-bound challenges. The gilded host had discarded all of it in favor of cold efficiency. Valerius, the orphan's oath, would use that forgotten honor as his shield and his sword. He engaged his knight's vox caster, broadcasting on a tight beam encrypted channel to the beleaguered Mechanicus command. "This is Princeps errant Valerius of House Alaric," he transmitted, his voice like iron. "I am loyal. I know this enemy, and I know how to make them bleed." A legend was being forged in the fires of Hestia, not of a great commander, but of a lone hunter, a ghost of the past come to haunt his twisted brethren. High above the inferno of Hestia, Secundus aboard his command vessel, the defiled grand cruiser, King's Folly, Archon Malagra observed the battle not as a series of engagements, but as a flow of pure, quantifiable data. The resistance of the Adeptus Mechanicus, for all its ferocity, was predictable. Their tactics were based on millennia of established combat doctrine, their responses governed by the cold, unyielding logic of the machine god. Malagra's gilded host, a single-willed entity, exploited this predictability with merciless efficiency. The Forge world was dying, its defenders being bled white in a war of perfect attrition. Yet the conquest was taking too long. The schedule, derived from the Xenos Codex, was precise. Hestia was not the goal. It was a resource, a necessary fuel stop on a far grander pilgrimage. The continued resistance, however doomed, was costing him time, and time was the one variable he could not afford to waste. He perceived the arrival of the free blade Valerius as a minor, irritating anomaly in the data stream. A single loyalist knight, a statistical improbability, was now aiding the Mechanicus forces, using his intimate knowledge of Alarican combat forms to anticipate and counter the movements of his former brethren. Valerius was leading small pockets of Scutari and servitor maniples in daring guerrilla strikes, appearing from the ruins to strike at the exposed rear armor of a knight before melting away again into the metallic jungle. He was a nuisance, a ghost in the machine, causing localized disruptions, but posing no real threat to the overall outcome. However, his presence represented something Malagra could not tolerate. A flicker of the old ways, a spark of defiance. It was an imperfection in his perfect weapon. It had to be purged, and its purging would serve a greater purpose. It was time to unleash the full, terrifying power of the network. It was time to break not just the armies of Hestia, but its soul. From his command throne, Malagra initiated the final protocol. He sent a silent, psychic command across his entire network, a command that pulsed through the crystalline lattice in every throne Mechanicum. It was not an order to attack or to maneuver. It was an order to suffer. He reached into the minds of the 1,000 enslaved nobles, still trapped and screaming within their iron prisons, and began to systematically amplify their torment. He took their despair, their shame, their impotent fury, and wove it into a coherent, weaponized wave of pure psychic misery. He orchestrated their silent screams into a choir of damnation. The nobles, who had been nothing more than living batteries, were now transformed into psychic amplifiers, their consciousness the focus lens for an attack of unimaginable spiritual horror. On the battlefields below, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A psychic shockwave, invisible but devastating, rolled out from the gilded host. It was a wave of pure, distilled hopelessness. The Scutari legions, their minds a blend of human emotion and cold logic, were the first to break. Their doctrina imperatives, the coded instructions that governed their every action, were drowned out by a tsunami of absolute despair. They saw visions of the Omnissiah, cold and dead amongst the stars. They perceived the utter futility of their struggle, the cold mathematical certainty of their own destruction. Rangers dropped their galvanic rifles and fell to their knees, their bionic eyes weeping tears of oil. Vanguard soldiers, moments before advancing in perfect formation, turned their radium carbines on their own commanders, or simply clawed at their own rebreathers, succumbing to a sudden, overwhelming madness. Entire regiments collapsed not from enemy fire, but from the sheer weight of spiritual annihilation. The princeps of Legio Vulcanum, ensconced in their command thrones, fared even worse. These were men and women of iron will, psychically bonded to their god engines. But the waking dream, as Malagra's attack was later named by the few who survived it, did not assault their will. It poisoned the very spirit of their machines. They felt a sudden, terrifying empathy with their enslaved foes. Through the psychic miasma, they felt the agony of the noble pilots, the horror of being a passenger to your own damnation. A princeps commanding the warlord Titan. Adamantium faith suddenly saw through the eyes of the Night Baron, who was methodically dismantling his void shields. He felt the Baron's despair, saw the faces of the wife and children the Baron was being forced to betray, and the vision shattered his sanity. The princeps screamed, a raw, animal sound that echoed through his Titan's bridge, and in a final spasm of madness, he overloaded his plasma annihilator, immolating his own god engine in a miniature sun. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Titans, the ultimate symbols of imperial might, faltered, their movements becoming sluggish and erratic as their crews were overwhelmed by shared, second-hand torment. Some simply shut down. Others turned their apocalyptic weaponry on one another in a final, tragic frenzy. Even Valerius was not immune. In the cockpit of the Orphan's Oath, he was hit by the full force of the psychic assault. It was the concentrated agony of his entire bloodline, 1,000 voices screaming in his mind. He saw his father's face, twisted in a rictus of shame. He heard his cousin Lyran begging for the release of death. The psychic pressure was immense, a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish his own consciousness. His knight stumbled, its systems flickering as his own mental control wavered. But Valerius was different. His long years in the Death Watch, hunting creatures of the warp and psychic Xenos, had forged his mind into a weapon. He had stood before the mind-twisting horrors of the void and had not broken. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bunching, and focused on a single burning image. The cold, emerald lenses of the sacristan Archon he now knew must be responsible. He anchored his sanity to the purity of his hatred. While the armies of the Imperium shattered around him, Valerius stood firm, a lone pillar of defiance in a sea of despair. The waking dream had broken the back of Hestia's defenses, but in doing so, it had confirmed for the last son of Alaric that this was a battle not for land or resources, but for the very soul of his people. The front had collapsed, the Forge world was lost, but for Valerius, the true war had just begun. The fall of Hestia, Secundus, was not a singular event, but a shockwave that propagated through the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Imperium at the speed of astropathic flight. The news arrived on Mars not as a coherent report, but as a fragmented chorus of screams. Final, desperate transmissions from Fabricator Locus Vrox 11, data ghosts of dying titans, and the psychic echoes of 1,000,000,000,000 shattered machine spirits coalesced into a single terrifying truth. An entire night world had committed the ultimate heresies of treason and tech blasphemy, and in doing so had broken one of the Segmentum's most vital forge worlds. The Red Planet, the thrumming heart of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was thrown into a state of schismatic turmoil not seen since the days of the Great Betrayal. In the data catacombs and noospheric chambers of the Martian Parliament, the Fabricator General himself, the ancient and inscrutable Udia Rask, convened an emergency conclave. The air in the chamber of the ruling Magi crackled with binary cant and indignant static. On one side were the traditionalists, the janitors, and artisans, who saw the events on Hestia as a tragic but isolated incident. They argued for a measured response, quarantine the subsector, dispatch Explorator fleets and Titan legions to ascertain the nature of the corruption and reclaim Hestia's archaeotech. They preached caution, logic, and the preservation of irreplaceable technology, even that which had fallen into enemy hands. They represented the slow, grinding, and meticulous nature of the Mechanicus. Opposing them was a faction of terrifying zealotry, the League of Veiled Cogitators, a hardline sect of tech priests who saw this heresy as a symptom of a deeper sickness. Their leader, Archmagos Valerius, a towering figure whose organic components were little more than a rumor, stood before the conclave, his voice a synthesized roar of pure indignation. He invoked the most feared name in the history of the cult Mechanicus, Kelbor Hall. He drew direct parallels between the betrayal of Alaric Prime and the dark pacts made by the former Fabricator General during the Horus Heresy. To Grus and his followers, this was not merely treason. It was the second coming of the original schism, a spiritual rot that had taken root within the very institutions allied to Mars. For 10,000 years, Grus boomed, his speech projected as perfectly formed streams of glowing script that hung in the air. We have suffered the impurity of the flesh to guide the sacred machines of the Questor Imperialis. We have trusted the frail, mutable emotions of human nobles to pilot war engines of divine origin. Alaric Prime is not an anomaly. It is the inevitable result of this flawed doctrine. The sacristan priesthood there did not fall to some new Xenos threat. They were weak, their faith in the pure machine compromised by their proximity to the biological. The cancer is not Alaric Prime. The cancer is the very concept of the night worlds. His words were a spark in a promethium refinery. The chamber erupted into a cacophony of dissent and furious agreement. Gruss and his league demanded a crusade of annihilation, a scouring of the feudal worlds. They called for every night world allied with Mars to be subjected to immediate and brutal scrutiny. Their knights were to be seized, their thrones, Mechanicum, disassembled for forensic analysis, their nobles placed in stasis cages for interrogation. Any world that resisted this edict was to be declared heretic and purged without mercy. He proposed the formation of new, pure Titan legions, crewed by vat-grown servitors and mindless clones, removing the unpredictable human element entirely. It was a proposal of such radical, paranoid extremism that it threatened to shatter the delicate political balance of the Martian Accords. The schism paralyzed the Adeptus Mechanicus, while the gilded host consolidated its hold on the ruins of Hestia Secundus, stripping its manufactorums of raw materials and archaeotech. The masters of Mars were engaged in a bitter, internal war of ideology. Fleets that should have been dispatched to counter the Crimson March were held in orbit above Mars, their orders shifting and changing as one faction gained temporary ascendancy over the other. Titan legions pledged their allegiance to either Rask's traditionalists or Gross's puritanical zealots, refusing to march alongside those they now considered potential heretics. The schism spread beyond Mars as other Forge worlds across the galaxy were forced to declare their stance. Forge world Risa, ever the rival of Mars, saw an opportunity and quietly pledged its support to Gruss, hoping to gain political power in the ensuing chaos. Metallica, bound by ancient oaths of loyalty to the night worlds it sponsored, declared Gruss's proposals to be the highest form of blasphemy and threatened secession. The Segmentum Command, based on Cypra Mundi, could only watch in horror. Lord Commander Militant Abriel Hecht, a man responsible for the defense of 1,000 worlds, found his requests for aid and reinforcement from the Adeptus Mechanicus met with silence, or worse, with contradictory orders from warring magi. His own fleets were forced to establish a crude cordon around the infected subsector, a flimsy barrier of ships against a tide of unknown proportions, all while the greatest industrial power in the galaxy tore itself apart from within. The betrayal of Alaric Prime had done more than cost the Imperium a fleet and a Forge world. It had struck a blow against the fragile trust that held the Imperium of man together. It had turned the most powerful and technologically advanced arm of the Imperium inward, consuming its own strength in a firestorm of paranoia and doctrinal strife. The gilded host marched on, unimpeded, while the Imperium's greatest defenders were busy pointing their guns at each other, arguing over the nature of sin as the sinner burned their house to the ground. The Martian schism had begun, and its paralysis was a more effective weapon for Malagra than any knight or warship in his arsenal. The campaign of the Gilded Host was unlike any war the sector had ever witnessed. It was not a war of conquest, for they left no garrisons. It was not a war of extermination, for they did not linger to savor the slaughter. It was a harvest, a systematic, terrifyingly efficient reaping of resources, conducted with the cold, detached precision of a logistical servitor ticking items off a manifest. After the fall of Hestia, the Crimson March swept through a dozen systems on the fringe of the newly formed Martian quarantine, its path dictated not by strategic value, but by a list of required materials encoded in the Xenos data codex Malagra served. For the enslaved nobles of Alaric Prime, this phase of the war was a new and deeper circle of hell. The initial shock of their subjugation and the forced betrayal of their oaths had been a sharp, clean agony. This was a slow, grinding torment, a death by 1,000 cuts to the soul. They were forced to be silent witnesses as their sacred war engines, once symbols of honor and duty, were turned into instruments of systematic planetary asset stripping. They watched through their own eyes as their knights, moving with that horrifying, unified grace, tore apart worlds. On the agri-world of Pan's harvest, they marched through fields of golden grain, their thermal cannons not firing on enemy soldiers, but incinerating hectares of farmland to create clear landing zones. They stood guard as legions of Malagra's lobotomized cultists rounded up the planet's entire population, billions of men, women, and children, herding them onto vast, repurposed ore haulers. The nobles could feel the terror of the civilians, a psychic stench that permeated their thrones, and they were powerless to stop it. They were jailers in their own bodies, their silent screams of protest merely adding to the psychic energy that fueled their damnation. On the mining world of Ferus Golgotha, they did not fight a battle. They conducted a demolition. Their battle cannons and volcano lances were used to crack open planetary crusts, exposing rich veins of adamantium and rare metals. They strode through the deep mines, their immense weight causing cave-ins that buried thousands of indentured workers, their actions dictated by optimal resource extraction patterns. The High King, Cor Alaric, from within the prison of the Honor Imperius, was forced to use his Castellan's siege-breaker cannons, weapons that had shattered the gates of chaos fortresses, to pulverize the orbital refineries, carefully shearing them from their moorings so they could be towed away by the gilded host's fleet. Every action was a desecration of his knight's history, a perversion of its machine spirit. And the shame was a physical, burning poison in his trapped consciousness. This was the tithe of souls. The human populations were not just casualties. They were a primary resource. Aboard the fleet's new flagship, the captured Archmagos vessel, Omnissiah's anvil, Malagra had constructed a series of monstrous soul forges. The captured billions from worlds like Pan's Harvest were rendered down, their bodies fed into bio-furnaces for raw energy, their life force, their very souls, siphoned off through arcane Xenos technology. This psychic energy was then refined into crystalline wafers of solidified agony, a stable power source of terrifying potency. The wafers were used to power the gilded host's most advanced systems, to enhance the unnatural efficiency of their ion shields, and to fuel the spatial translations that allowed their fleet to move with such impossible speed. The war was literally being fueled by the souls of the innocent, a logistical chain of absolute horror. The enslaved nobles were psychically tethered to this process. Malagra ensured they felt every moment of it. They felt the terror of the captured, the pain of the rendering, the final, fading spark of a billion lives being extinguished. It was a constant, overwhelming tide of death that washed through their minds, day after day. The psychic feedback served two purposes for Malagra. Firstly, it generated a constant state of heightened torment in the nobles, maximizing the energy output of the psychic network they were unwillingly part of. Secondly, it was a method of spiritual erosion, designed to break any lingering vestiges of hope or defiance. He was not just using their bodies, he was grinding their souls down to dust, ensuring that even if they were ever freed, there would be nothing left to save. Some nobles went mad, their consciousness unable to withstand the constant influx of horror, simply shattered. When this happened, their knight would stop for a moment, motionless on the battlefield or in the hangar of a ship, before its systems would reboot. It would then resume its duties with even greater efficiency, its movements becoming sharper, more mechanical. The spark of the human soul, with its inefficient emotions and vestiges of resistance, was gone, leaving only a perfect, cold machine slaved to the network. Malagra noted this phenomenon with detached interest. It was a sign that the fusion of the biological and the mechanical was nearing its next stage. The tithe of souls was a means to an end. The gilded host was not just gathering resources for a journey. It was being refined in the crucible of this horrific war, burned clean of the last messy remnants of its humanity, preparing itself for its final sacred purpose. The Crimson March was not just a path of destruction. It was a pilgrimage of transformation. News of the gilded host's horrific harvest filtered back to the imperial lines in whispers and fragmented reports from the few scout ships that dared breach the quarantine zone. They told impossible stories of entire worlds stripped bare, of populations vanishing overnight, of a ghost fleet that moved without rhyme or reason, according to any sane military doctrine. Within the shattered remnants of the Hestia defense forces, now regrouped under the iron-willed command of the Death Watch, a grim understanding began to dawn. This was not a war they could win through attrition or conventional strategy. The enemy was not conquering, it was consuming, and its appetite was endless. They were fighting a logistical nightmare, a self-fueling engine of destruction. Princeps errant, Valerius, now a grim, haunted figure, became the focal point of the imperial resistance. He had survived the waking dream, and in its aftermath, he had become a legend to the terrified Scutariae and shell-shocked guardsmen who had survived the fall of Hestia. They called him the Ghost of Alaric, the last honorable knight. But Valerius felt no honor, only the burning shame of his house and the cold, ceaseless drive for vengeance. He pored over the tactical data, the reports of the gilded host's movements, searching for a pattern, a weakness, anything to exploit. He and Watch Captain Lycaon worked in the data sanctum of the vigilance of Dorn. The air thick with the scent of ozone and recycled air, their faces illuminated by the green glow of tactical displays. They saw the enemy's path was not random. It was a spiral, slowly but surely tightening, its trajectory aimed back towards a single, constant point in the void. The Alaric system. The horrifying truth became clear. The gilded host was not simply rampaging. It was gathering specific resources, archaeotech from Hestia, raw materials from the mining worlds, and a terrifying tithe of psychic energy from the harvested populations. It was assembling the components for some grand, final ritual. A ritual that was to take place on Alaric Prime itself. Their homeworld was not just the enemy's origin point. It was their ultimate objective. It was there, Valerius reasoned, that the heart of the enemy's power must lie. It was there that the sacristan Archon Malagra, the architect of this damnation, would be at his most powerful, but also, perhaps, at his most vulnerable, when orchestrating his final blasphemy. From this revelation, a plan was born. A plan of such staggering audacity and suicidal odds that only men who had already lost everything could conceive it. They would not try to meet the gilded host's fleet in open battle. They did not have the numbers. They would not try to fortify a world against them. They had seen the futility of that on Hestia. Instead, they would take the fight to the serpent's head. They would lead a desperate, surgical strike against Alaric Prime itself. Their target, the Grand Sacristy, the central Forge Temple, where for centuries the throne's Mechanicum had been maintained, and, as they now knew, corrupted. Valerius theorized that this must be the location of the master control node for the entire Xenos network, the central cogitator shrine from which Malagra commanded his legion of puppets. Their desperate gambit was to sever the connection, to decapitate the entity by destroying its brain. The plan was a suicide mission on a colossal scale. The Alaric system was now the most heavily fortified location in the sector, its orbital wreckage turned into a lethal defense grid, its silent world guarded by the gilded host's most powerful elements. A direct assault was impossible. They would have to use guile and speed. Watch Captain Lycaon secured the aid of the only forces in the sector with the will and the means to attempt such a strike. A demi-company of Imperial fists from the battle barge, Shield of Valor, veterans of countless sieges, and a small, elite contingent of Cadian shock troops, survivors of the fall of their own world. Men and women who knew what it was to fight on in the face of annihilation. Their combined force was pitifully small. A single Death Watch strike cruiser, a handful of Astartes, Thunderhawks, and Storm Ravens, and one loyal knight. The plan had two phases. Phase 1 was distraction. The remnants of the Hestia fleet and several newly arrived squadrons from Segmentum Command would launch a massive diversionary assault on the gilded host's outer picket lines, drawing the bulk of their fleet into a furious engagement at the edge of the system. This attack was doomed to fail. Its only purpose to buy a few precious hours and create a window of chaos. During that window, Phase 2 would commence. The Vigilance of Dorn, its hull plating modified with salvaged stealth materials and its energy signature dampened to a bare minimum, would attempt a high-speed ghost run through the system's outer defenses, aiming for a polar insertion into Alaric Prime's atmosphere, a trajectory no sane commander would ever attempt due to the planet's unstable magnetic fields. From there, Valerius and the Imperial fists would drop directly onto the Grand Sacristy. The final briefing was held in the hangar bay of the Vigilance of Dorn, under the shadow of the Orphan's Oath. Valerius stood before the assembled Astartes and Cadians, his face projected onto a large screen for the naval officers. He did not speak of victory or glory. He spoke of necessity and sacrifice. "We are not going to Alaric Prime to save it," he said, his voice raw. "That world is already dead. We are not going to free my brothers. Their souls are already forfeit. We are going there to cauterize a wound. This heresy is a cancer, and we are the surgeon's blade. We will cut it out at its heart, even if it means burning the patient to the bone." There were no cheers, only the grim, determined silence of soldiers who understood the cost. They were the desperate gambit, the final, forlorn hope of a sector on its knees. Their mission was not to win the war, but to give the Imperium a chance to survive it, by striking at the one place the enemy would never expect, the home they had already destroyed. The void around the Alaric system erupted into a maelstrom of violence. The Imperial Navy's diversionary force, a motley collection of battered cruisers and vengeful destroyers, slammed into the gilded host's picket line like a power fist into a fortress wall. Lances of incandescent light tore through the darkness, and the silent blossoming of detonating warships became the stars by which the desperate assault was navigated. The battle was a massacre, just as planned. The Imperial ships were outmatched and outnumbered, but they fought with the fury of the damned, selling their lives to buy minutes, each exploding vessel a victory in the grim calculus of the gambit. From the command deck of the King's Folly, Archon Malagra observed the attack with cold, analytical disinterest. It was a futile, predictable gesture. He allocated a precise percentage of his fleet to annihilate the attackers and turned his primary attention back to the preparations on Alaric Prime. The diversion was working perfectly. Under the cover of this cosmic carnage, the vigilance of Dorn made its ghost run. The strike cruiser, stripped of all non-essential systems, ran cold and silent through the outer debris fields, its hull groaning under the strain of radical gravitic maneuvers. It slipped past the automated defense platforms, its machine spirit placated by Death Watch tech marines to emit the recognition codes of a long-lost Alarican frigate. For a terrifying hour, they were a ghost in the machine, a single prayer whispered in the heart of a hurricane. They reached the calculated polar insertion point, and the ship plunged into the violent, swirling aurora of Alaric Prime's upper atmosphere. The hull screamed as it superheated, glowing a dull cherry red, but the void shields, pushed far beyond their breaking point, held. Then the drop. The hangar bay doors opened into a sky of fire and electrical discharge. Thunderhawks and storm ravens, carrying the imperial fists and Cadian veterans, launched into the storm. And last, Valerius. The orphan's oath was kicked from its magnetic clamps, dropping like a stone towards the steel-gray surface below. For a moment, he was just a falling giant, the winds of his desecrated home screaming past his cockpit. He fired his own jump jets, arresting his fall and directing his descent towards the target, the grand sacristy, a continent of brass-etched gates and towering forge spires that dominated the blasted capital city. Their landing was an earthquake. The imperial fists, led by the stoic Sergeant Kalen, secured the landing zone with disciplined bolter fire, cutting down the skeletal servitor guards that patrolled the sacristy's outer courts. Valerius landed in the center of the primary plaza, his knight's impact cracking the marble that he had once walked upon as a boy. The air was thick with the smell of burnt promethium and something else, a cloying, sweet scent of psychic energy that made his teeth ache. The enemy's response was immediate and overwhelming. They had struck the nerve center, and the body was convulsing to protect it. From the great archways of the sacristy emerged knights, dozens of them, their colors the proud livery of his own house, now moving with that terrible, silent unity. They had been waiting. The battle that followed was a brutal, hopeless siege. The imperial fists formed a bulwark of yellow ceramite around the plaza, their bolters chipping away at the knight's leg armor, while Cadian heavy weapon teams set up lascannons in the ruins, their concentrated fire aiming for visor slits and weapon joints. But it was a battle of mortals against gods. A night warden swept its Avenger Gatling cannon across a Cadian position, and the soldiers vanished in a red spray. A gallant charged the Astartes line, its thunderstrike gauntlet pulverizing a trio of imperial fists in a single crushing blow. Valerius was the eye of the storm. He moved through the battle not as a brawler, but as a duelist. He engaged his kin, calling them by their names, reciting the oaths they had sworn together, all while his thermal cannon melted their weapons, and his reaper chains oared severed their limbs. Baron Hexter, remember the defense of the Agrippina sector. Fight it, he roared over the vox, even as he parried a blow from Hexter's knight and plunged his own chainsword into its cockpit. Each kill was a fresh wound upon his soul. At the heart of the plaza, a new giant emerged from the central forge gate. It was the Honor Imperius, the Dominus class Castellan of High King Cor Alaric, Valerius's own liege lord and distant uncle. The knight was a walking sacrilege, its once proud heraldry overlaid with glowing, sickly green circuitry that pulsed in time with some unseen heart. It did not move with the measured tread of a king, but with the fluid, predatory grace of a beast. This was Malagra's chosen vessel, his royal guard. "Kalen," Valerius voxed, his voice strained. "The heart of the shrine lies beyond that gate. Get your men inside. I will hold the king." The Imperial Fist Sergeant gave a curt acknowledgement. "For Dorn and the Emperor," and led a desperate charge towards the forge gate, using the shadow of Valerius's duel as their only cover. The clash of kings was a battle of mythic proportions. The Orphan's Oath, a Questoris class knight, was vastly outmatched by the sheer firepower and armor of the Dominus class Castellan. Volcano lance fire gouged molten trenches in the plaza floor. Plasma decimator blasts turned the air to glass. Valerius survived on pure skill and desperation. He used the ruins for cover, his movements precise and economical, forcing the larger knight into close quarters where its devastating long-range weapons were less effective. He could feel the High King's consciousness within the machine, a burning coal of pure, undiluted hatred and agony, trapped and raging against its prison. The duel was a tragic dance amidst the apocalyptic chaos of the dying assault. Valerius, with tears he would never admit to streaming down his face, parried a blow from the Castellan's thundercoil harpoon and thrust his chains oared deep into its primary plasma reactor. The feedback was catastrophic. As alarms blared and the mighty knight began to slump, its reactor breached. Valerius broadcast one last message on a private channel, a whisper for his king alone. "Your oath is fulfilled, my liege. Rest now." Through the psychic static, he felt a flicker of something, a bare instant of gratitude, before the consciousness of Cor Alaric was finally, mercifully, extinguished in the fire of his dying machine. The king had fallen. The path to the Archon was open. Sergeant Kalen and his remaining Imperial fists, a mere dozen now from the 50 who had made planetfall, breached the forge gate under the cover of Valerius's epic duel. They found themselves not in a manufactorum of gears and pistons, but in a cathedral of technological blasphemy. The grand sacristy's interior had been transformed. Cables, thick as a man's torso, snaked across the walls, pulsing with a venomous green light. The air hummed with a palpable psychic pressure, and the rhythmic, metallic clang of the industry had been replaced by a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls. At the chamber's center where the primary anvils of the Omnissiah should have stood, was a colossal, pulsating sphere of black, crystalline material, suspended in a web of energy conduits. Floating in stasis pods, arranged in a circle around the sphere, were the flayed, living bodies of Alaric Prime's most powerful astropaths, their minds shackled and their mouths open in a permanent, silent scream. This was the master control node, the heart of the gilded host. Standing before the sphere, his back to them, was Sacristan Archon Malagra. He was no longer just a robed tech priest. He was physically connected to the device, dozens of shimmering cables emerging from his spine and skull, plugging him directly into the network. He was the nexus, the living processor for the will of his silent masters. "You are too late, sons of Dorn," Malagra spoke, his voice echoing from every corner of the chamber at once. He did not turn. "The great work is nearly complete. Your nuisance has been noted and will be purged." From the shadows, his personal guard emerged, a cadre of Sicaran ruststalkers, their transonic blades vibrating with a sickening hum, their movements unnaturally swift and silent. The battle was short and brutal. The Imperial fists formed a tight circle, their bolters roaring in the enclosed space. They were masters of defensive warfare, but the ruststalkers were wraiths of murder, their every strike calculated for maximum lethality. Kalen saw 2 of his brothers fall, their ceramite plate parted like cloth by the transonic weapons, before he smashed a ruststalker's head in with the butt of his bolter. It was a battle they could not win, only endure. While his brothers sold their lives, Kalen focused on the true objective. "Valerius," he roared into his vox, "the target is here. We cannot breach it. It is shielded." Outside, Valerius, standing over the wreckage of the High King's Knight, heard the call. He saw the forge gate, the last barrier. His own knight, the orphan's oath, was crippled. Its right arm was a mangled stump. Its reactor was bleeding radiation, and warning runes flashed across his screen in a frantic dance of death. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, before a catastrophic overload. There was only one path left. It was not a choice. It was a final, terrible duty. He broadcast to Kalen on a private channel, his voice calm amidst the cacophony of his dying machine. "Sergeant, get your men clear of the central device. I have 1 shot left." Kalen understood instantly. He did not question the order. "Marines, to the walls! Tactical withdrawal now!" he commanded, his men laying down suppressing fire as they fell back from the black sphere. Valerius turned the orphan's oath to face the gate. He diverted all remaining power, everything he had, from life support, from weapons, from the flickering lights of his cockpit, and poured it all into the Knight's legs and its reactor. He began to run. The immense machine, trailing smoke and shedding armor plates, charged across the plaza, its stride a lurching, agonizing death sprint. It smashed through the burning remnants of the dueling knights, its momentum building with every thunderous step. It hit the grand sacristy's forge gate at full speed. Adamantium screamed and tore as the knight, a 2,000-ton battering ram of pure vengeance, punched through the ancient doors and into the chamber beyond. Malagra turned then, his emerald lenses widening in what might have been surprise as the smoking, charging form of the orphan's oath filled his vision. Valerius did not stop. He was aiming for the central sphere, the heart of the network. The last of Kalen's men scrambled for cover as the knight, now a guided missile, roared past them. As it reached the center of the room, Valerius triggered the final, desperate command: reactor overload. He shut his eyes. His last thought, a quiet prayer to the Emperor, and a silent apology to the machine spirit that had served him so faithfully. The explosion was not fire and fury. It was a silent detonation of pure energy. The Knight's warp core reactor, deliberately breached, created a powerful, localized EMP and a feedback loop of unimaginable psychic force. The blast wave of pure data and soul stuff slammed into the black crystalline sphere. A terrible, silent scream echoed not in the air, but in the mind of every living thing for 1,000 miles. The stasis pods holding the astropaths shattered, their occupants instantly sublimating into dust. The conduits feeding the sphere exploded in showers of green sparks. Archon Malagra was thrown back, the cables ripping from his spine, his body convulsing as the raw, unfiltered agony of 1,000 broken minds poured into him. The psychic backlash, the silent scream, pulsed through the entire network. Across Alaric Prime, and out into the void where the Gilded Host's fleet was still fighting, every knight seized up at once. But the connection was not severed. The nobles were not freed. The Xenos network, in a final act of self-preservation, had shunted the catastrophic feedback directly into the captive consciousnesses of the pilots. For the nobles of Alaric Prime, it was a final, horrific mercy. Their minds, already stretched to the breaking point by months of torment, were subjected to a surge of psychic energy equivalent to staring into the heart of the Astronomicon. Their consciousnesses, their souls, their very identities were burned to ash in a single, silent, merciful instant. On the battlefield, the knights stood motionless for a full 10 seconds. Then, as one, they began to move again. Their movements were different now. The last vestiges of human grace, the faint echoes of their pilot's muscle memory, were gone. They moved with the cold, absolute, twitch-perfect precision of true automatons. The feedback loop had not destroyed the network. It had perfected it. By extinguishing the last spark of humanity within the machines, Valerius had inadvertently cut the final anchor that weighed them down. The gilded host was momentarily stunned before resuming its mission with the cold, absolute perfection of a soulless intelligence. Its last, screaming spark of humanity extinguished forever. In the ruins of the Grand Sacristy, Sergeant Kalen watched in horror as the knights outside reformed their lines, their actions faster and more deadly than before. Valerius's sacrifice had not been a victory. It had been the catalyst for the enemy's final evolution. The unfettered host, as it would come to be known in the sealed annals of the Ordo Zeno, was a terror fundamentally different from what had come before. The gilded host had been a legion of puppets, their movements still subtly influenced by the subconscious instincts and muscle memory of the captive pilots. They fought with a chilling unity, but it was the unity of a perfectly drilled army. The unfettered host was something else entirely. It was a single organism. The psychic drag of 1,000 resisting human minds, a constant, low-level spiritual friction within the network, was gone. Freed from this final biological limitation, the host's processing speed and reaction time increased exponentially. It was as if a great weight had been lifted, allowing the cold, alien intelligence to exert its will with absolute, frictionless perfection. On Alaric Prime, the consequences were immediate and apocalyptic for the surviving Imperial forces. Sergeant Kalen and his handful of Imperial fists witnessed the transformation firsthand. The knights outside the shattered Grand Sacristy, which had been fighting as a coordinated but still distinct group of individuals, suddenly moved as if they were all limbs of a single body. A knight paladin, its arm severed by Valerius, did not retreat. Instead, a nearby armiger warglaive instantly moved to cover its blind spot, its thermal spear firing with a precision that suggested it was seeing through the paladin's own optics. 3 knights simultaneously concentrated their fire on a single crumbling bastion where the Cadians were making their last stand. The volley so perfectly timed that all three projectiles struck the exact same molecule of rockcrete, shattering the wall in a single explosive instant. The battle was over in minutes. The Astartes were not outfought. They were deconstructed, their defensive positions dismantled with the cold, systematic logic of a tech priest disassembling a faulty cogitator. Kaelin's last stand was against two knights who flanked him with a maneuver so perfectly synchronized it seemed to defy the laws of physics. His last sight was of two chain Zords descending as one. The change rippled out into the void. The Imperial Navy fleet, already decimated by the diversionary battle, suddenly found itself facing an enemy that had become exponentially more deadly. The Gilded Host's warships, now crewed entirely by the Central Intelligence, executed maneuvers that no human or servitor-crewed vessel could hope to match. They moved in flawless geometric formations, their weapon batteries firing in perfectly timed salvos that overwhelmed void shields through sheer, calculated saturation. An Imperial cruiser that attempted a daring torpedo run found its target vessel executing a last-second, high-G burn that was physically impossible for a crewed ship to survive, causing the torpedoes to miss by mere meters, while simultaneously bringing its own broadside cannons to bear on a different, more vulnerable target. The fleet action turned from a battle into a slaughter. The Imperial Navy broke and fled. Its command structure shattered, its morale annihilated by an enemy that did not seem to be bound by the normal constraints of warfare. With the local system purged of all resistance, the unfettered host abandoned any pretense of a conventional military campaign. There was no more methodical harvesting, no more strategic conquest. Its primary objective, the awakening of its slumbering masters, was now paramount, and the resources it had gathered were sufficient. With Alaric Prime now serving as a massive, planet-sized command and control node, Archon Malagra, now a gibbering, broken creature permanently hardwired into the remains of the central sphere, initiated the final phase of the pilgrimage. The entire host, a fleet of captured vessels, with the soulless knights standing silent sentinel on their hangar decks, gathered in high orbit. Then, in a terrifying display of their new, perfected power, they executed a simultaneous, coordinated warp jump. Not in a staggered fleet formation, but as a single entity. Over 1,000 vessels, from the smallest patrol craft to the largest Mechanicus, vanished from reality at the exact same microsecond. Navigators and astropaths on distant watch stations felt a sudden, violent void in the warp, as if a hole had been punched through the very fabric of the Empyrean. The host did not travel through the warp in a conventional sense. It moved with a brutal, directed purpose, like a spear tip driven through a canvas. It ignored the currents and tides of the Empyrean, forcing its own path through sheer, unified will. Its journey was a series of precise, breathtakingly fast jumps, a direct, brutal line drawn across the galactic map. It appeared in a system only long enough to get its bearings, its 1,000 ships materializing from the warp in a perfect sphere for a fraction of a second before vanishing again. It did not stop to engage. It did not deviate. It did not hesitate. It was a phantom army, its appearances so brief that by the time Imperial authorities could confirm the sightings, the host was already gone, another dozen light years closer to its final, hidden destination. The Crimson March was over. The final pilgrimage had begun, and it was moving towards its goal with the terrible, unstoppable certainty of a falling star. The Imperium was no longer facing a rogue army. It was facing a phenomenon, a new and terrible power that played by rules it could not comprehend. After a series of flawless spatial translations that left a trail of stunned augur reports and terrified astropaths in its wake, the unfettered host arrived. Its final destination was not a place known to any imperial star chart or Mechanicus data codex. It was a dead system, a lonely white dwarf star orbited by nothing but a thin veil of cold dust and the ghosts of long-dead planets. But surrounding the star, in silent, patient majesty, was the true objective. A Dyson sphere, a megastructure of such impossible scale and perfect construction that it dwarfed any creation of mankind. Its surface was a uniform, non-reflective black, broken by geometric patterns of dormant energy conduits that traced across its continents of necrodermis. This was no mere stellar collector. This was a fortress, a palace, and most importantly, a tomb. This was the crown world of the forgotten Sautekhan dynasty, the Tomb of Whispers, the final resting place of the Nihilach overlord, Thassar the Invincible, before his self-imposed exile. The unfettered host's fleet arranged itself in a precise, pre-calculated orbital pattern around the immense sphere. There was no communication, no ceremony. The work began instantly. The captured Archmagos, the Omnissiah's anvil, its forges now repurposed for a far darker purpose, moved towards a specific, unmarked point on the sphere's surface. From its vast manufacturing bays, it began extruding immense metallic pylons, forged from the adamantium of Ferrous Golgotha and inscribed with complex, glowing green circuitry derived from the sacristan's forbidden lore. The knights of the host descended onto the surface of the Dyson sphere, their magnetic clamps anchoring them to the alien metal. They moved across the silent landscape like graven idols, taking up positions at the nexus points of the dormant energy grid. Their purpose soon became terrifyingly clear. They were not here to attack the tomb. They were here to unlock it. The entire campaign, the betrayal, the harvesting, the tithe of souls, had all been components of a single, colossal key. The sacristan priesthood of Alaric Prime, corrupted millennia ago by a shard of Sotacon programming that had survived a starship crash, had been acting as unwitting servants, their entire heresy a long-game activation protocol for their true masters. Now, the final sequence was initiated. The knights, positioned at the nexus points, plunged thick power cables from their own reactors into the sphere's surface. They began to channel their own energy, the stolen life force of billions, into the dormant Necron grid. The Dyson sphere, silent for 60 million years, began to stir. Faint green light began to pulse deep beneath the black necrodermis, spreading outwards from the knights in a slow, geometric pattern, like frost forming on a cold window. The air, the hard vacuum of space, began to hum with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in the very atoms of the Imperial ships' hulls. On the surface, vast sections of the sphere began to shift and reconfigure. Platforms rose. Immense tomb citadels emerged from hidden sublevels, and cyclopean gateways, large enough to admit a Titan legion, irised open, revealing silent, cavernous interiors. The knights were not just power sources, they were command nodes, their corrupted machine spirits interfacing with the tomb's master control, their enslaved thrones providing the psychic resonance needed to bypass ancient security protocols. Each knight was a key, and together they were unlocking the greatest Necron tomb world ever discovered in the Segmentum Pacificus. Deep within the sphere, in the central chronogen chamber, where time itself was held in stasis, a single sarcophagus began to glow. Within it, the consciousness of the Overlord stirred from its long slumber. It was not a violent, sudden awakening, but a slow, cold dawning of awareness. It felt the input from its ancient protocols, the report of the successful activation sequence. It felt the psychic resonance of the strange hybrid machines on its surface, the faint, lingering taste of the human souls they had consumed to power this awakening. It was a flavor it had not tasted since the war in heaven. The plan, set in motion 60 million years ago by a simple contingency probe, had finally come to fruition. A lesser race had been manipulated into becoming the perfect servants, delivering not only the means of awakening, but a ready-made army of powerful war engines, already slaved to its will. The awakening was slow, methodical, and utterly silent. There was no grand declaration, no triumphant roar, just the silent, inexorable activation of a power that had slept since before the birth of mankind. Canoptek spiders and scarabs began to skitter from hidden portals, their multifaceted eyes glowing as they began the work of repairing and maintaining the waking tomb. Legions of Necron warriors, their Gauss flayers still cold, began to receive the activation command in their engrammatic pathways. The Tomb of Whispers was no longer whispering. It was beginning to speak, and its voice was the sound of 1 billion sleeping soldiers snapping to attention. The unfettered host had completed its pilgrimage. It had delivered the key and opened the door. Now it stood guard, a soulless honor guard of fallen heroes, awaiting the arrival of its true master. The Imperium, though crippled by the Martian schism and reeling from the Gilded Host's phantom crusade, was not entirely blind. The final, massive warp signature of the host's pilgrimage had been tracked, its destination pinpointed by a dozen desperate astropathic choirs before they were snuffed out by the sheer proximity of the awakening Necron presence. A pursuit fleet, hastily assembled and bearing the weight of the Emperor's own authority, had been shadowing the host's path, always one step behind. It was a fleet of vengeance, a collection of the best and most resolute forces the Segmentum could muster on such short notice. It was led by the golden battle barge, Sol Invictus, and upon its bridge stood Shield Captain Artorian, a custodian of the Adeptus Custodes, his presence a sign of how gravely the High Lords of Terra viewed this new threat. Artorian's fleet translated from the warp into the dead system, and was met with a sight that silenced every man and woman on every bridge. The sheer, impossible scale of the Dyson sphere, the Tomb of Whispers, was a violation of natural law, an insult to the divine architecture of the Emperor's galaxy. Arrayed before it, in perfect, silent, defensive formation, was the unfettered host. There were no hails, no challenges. The time for communication was long past. Artorian, his ancient mind a repository of 10,000 years of warfare, saw the pulsing green energy of the sphere and understood the dire nature of the situation. This was not a battle to reclaim territory or punish traitors. This was a battle to prevent an apocalypse. All vessels, his voice, calm and resonant as a funeral bell, echoed across the fleet's command channel. Purge protocol is engaged. No quarter, no mercy. Do not allow a single one of those machines to fulfill its purpose. The Emperor protects. The Imperial Fleet, a coalition of Imperial Navy cruisers, Space Marine strike forces from the Black Templars, and a full battle group of gray knights surged forward. The final battle began. The space war was a vision of hell. The unfettered host, its ships and knights now fully integrated with the Dyson Sphere's awakening defense grid, fought with a prescience that bordered on supernatural. They seemed to know where the Imperial ships would be before they were there, their lances and weapon batteries firing into empty space, only for a vessel to drop from a high G maneuver directly into the path of the volley. But the Imperial forces were not the panicked defenders of Hestia. This was a fleet of zealots and heroes, led by a demigod in golden armor. The Black Templars, in a fury of righteous hatred, launched boarding torpedoes, their breacher squads smashing into the hulls of the captured Imperial vessels, fighting bloody, close-quarters battles against mindless servitors and combat automata in the corridors of their own stolen ships. While the battle raged in the void, the true spearhead of the Imperial assault began the Grey Knights, their minds shielded by the Aegis and their nemesis force weapons humming with power, teleported directly onto the surface of the Dyson Sphere. They appeared in a flash of silver light amidst the ranks of the waiting knights, a sudden intrusion of divine purpose into a realm of soulless machinery. They were surrounded instantly. The knights, which had been passive conduits, now turned their full attention to the intruders. The battle on the sphere's surface was one of stark, brutal contrasts. The swift, fluid grace of the Grey Knights against the rigid, unstoppable power of the knights. A brother captain parried the blow of a Reaper Chainsword with his force halberd, the psychic flare of the impact momentarily staggering the giant machine. Terminators with psycannons unleashed storms of blessed energy, stripping away the unnatural ion shields and blasting holes in adamantium armor. But the knights were relentless. For every Grey Knight who felled a machine, another two would adjust their firing positions to annihilate him. They had no sense of self-preservation, only objective-based threat assessment. They would sacrifice themselves without hesitation. A knight gallant deliberately overloading its reactor to catch a squad of paladins in the blast, simply because the tactical calculus deemed it the most efficient way to eliminate the threat. The Grey Knights, the Imperium's ultimate weapon against the demonic, found themselves fighting a foe that was the antithesis of chaos. There was no rage, no passion, no warp craft to counter. There was only the cold, unyielding, and perfect logic of the machine, and it was a logic of death. Shield Captain Artorian led the final, desperate gambit. Aboard a customized Aquila lander, he and a retinue of his fellow custodians breached the sphere's surface, their vessel weaving through a storm of anti-aircraft fire that would have vaporized any lesser craft. They landed near the largest of the awakening tomb citadels, their goal not to fight the knights, but to enter the tomb itself and strike at the awakening Necron leadership. They were met by the elite of the unfettered host, the Dominus-class knights, the personal guard of the fallen High King, now the praetorians of a new master. Artorian, wielding his guardian spear with a grace and power that was breathtaking to behold, met the charge of a knight valiant. He did not try to match its strength. He flowed around it, his auramite armor deflecting a blow from a thunder coil harpoon that could have toppled a hab block. He leapt onto the knight's chassis, running up its leg like a striking serpent, and plunged his spear through the knight's visor, slit the blade's disintegrator field, turning the cockpit and its dead pilot to incandescent gas. The custodians were magnificent, a whirlwind of gold and crimson against the defiled heraldry of the knights. They fought their way to the entrance of the tomb citadel. The ground around them, littered with the burning husks of the most powerful war machines of the fallen knight world. But the cost was immense. For every knight they destroyed, a custodian fell, their nigh invulnerable armor finally breached by the sheer, overwhelming, and perfectly coordinated firepower. As Artorian, the last of his retinue still standing, finally reached the Cyclopean gate, it began to slide shut. The awakening was reaching its final stage. The tomb was sealing itself. Behind him, the battle still raged, the Grey Knights being slowly, systematically eradicated. In the void, the Imperial fleet was broken, the Sol Invictus itself crippled and burning. The Imperium had thrown its best at the unfettered host, and it had not been enough. They had bought time, but it was time that had already run out. The final litany had been spoken, and the tomb was awake as the last golden gleam of Shield Captain Artorian's armor vanished behind the sealing gates of the tomb citadel. A new energy signature pulsed from the heart of the Dyson sphere. It was not a weapon firing, nor was it the flare of a reactor coming online. It was something far stranger, a wave of profound and utter nullity that expanded outwards at the speed of light. It was a psychic dead zone, a bubble of absolute spiritual silence. The Grey Knights on the sphere's surface were the first to feel its full effect. The comforting light of the Emperor in their minds vanished, replaced by a cold, empty void. The Empyrean, the turbulent sea of psychic energy they drew their power from, was becalmed, rendered inert, and lifeless. Their nemesis weapons flickered and died, their psychic hoods filled with a roaring silence, and their connection to their battle brothers was severed. They were suddenly just men in ornate armor, isolated and alone in a universe that had lost its soul. The unfettered host, immune to this wave, methodically exterminated the last of them. In the void, the effect was just as catastrophic. The navigators on the surviving Imperial ships screamed as their third eyes were blinded. The guiding light of the Astronomicon not just obscured, but utterly extinguished, as if it had never existed. Astropaths collapsed, their minds irrevocably broken by the sudden, total absence of the warp's song. Ships engaged in warp travel within the expanding bubble were torn apart, their Geller fields collapsing as the fundamental nature of reality shifted around them. The Imperial fleet, already shattered, was now crippled and blind, lost in a sea of silent, star-dusted blackness. The battle was over. The Imperium had lost. The unfettered host, its purpose fulfilled, began to systematically shut down. Their mission was complete. One by one, the Knights of Alaric Prime went dormant, their reactors cooling, their lights fading. They became statues on the surface of the great sphere, silent monuments to their own damnation, their defiled banners fluttering once in the non-existent wind before hanging limp and still. Their war was over. They were no longer an army. They were artifacts, the discarded key to a now open lock. Inside the central chronogeon, the Necron overlord finally rose from his sarcophagus. He was not Thassar the Invincible. Thassar was a legend, a memory. This being was something else, a mind that had spent 60 million years in silent contemplation of the Great Sleep, and had come to a new, terrible conclusion. The endless cycles of war, the petty ambitions of the Silent King, the pointless rage of the Flayed Ones, it was all meaningless, a chaotic equation that could never be solved. The true enemy was not the Old Ones, nor the Eldar, nor mankind. The true enemy was consciousness itself, the chaotic, unpredictable energy of the warp that it generated, the very thing that had given birth to the Catan and started the great, terrible war. The only path to true, lasting peace, the only logical solution to the problem of existence, was silence. Absolute silence. Archon Malagra, his broken body still wired into the remains of the control node, had been the Overlord's final tool. His last command, forced through the tech priest's shattered mind, was not to awaken an army to conquer the galaxy. It was to activate the Dyson sphere's primary and hitherto unknown function. It was not a weapon. It was a paracausal resonator, an engine of anti-reality. The wave of nullity it emitted was not a temporary field. It was a permanent change to the fabric of space-time, a creeping zone of psychic stillness that would expand indefinitely, slowly but surely, calming the turbulent sea of the warp. The Overlord had not woken to restart a war, but to end existence itself, to bring the peace of the silent tomb to the entire, screaming galaxy. The legacy of Alaric Prime was Ash. It was a name that would be spoken only in whispers, a cautionary tale of loyalty so absolute it became the instrument of galaxy-spanning damnation. The sector, once a bustling hub of imperial industry and faith, was now the heart of the new silent zone, a region hundreds of light years across where the warp was calm, where astropathic communication was impossible, and where the light of the Astronomicon could not reach. The worlds within this zone were cut off, isolated, plunged into a new dark age of superstition and fear. Each planet an island alone in an endless, silent night. The Martian schism would rage for centuries, a bitter, self-destructive conflict born from the paranoia of this great betrayal, forever weakening the Adeptus Mechanicus. The legend born from the war was not one of glory, but of tragedy. The legend of Valerius, the last loyalist, a hero whose final, desperate act of sacrifice had inadvertently perfected the weapon of his enemy. And the legend of the gilded host, the knights who had been so loyal, they never broke their oaths, even when their souls were screaming, serving their new masters with the same unyielding devotion with which they had once served the emperor. Their final victory was not a conquest, but the creation of a vast, silent monument to a war that had cost the Imperium a piece of its soul and given birth to a new, quiet apocalypse, a creeping silence that threatened to one day engulf the stars themselves.